Hello and welcome to Amnesty International and Fight for the Future's second Salon on the implications of web3 technologies for human rights and activism. I'm Leah Holland, Campaigns and Communications Director with Fight for the Future. I use she, they pronouns, and I'm based in Portland, Oregon. I want to start off with some house rules for the chat, which was full of respectful debate last time. The rules are simple. 1, assume good intentions from those you're interacting with and our speakers. We're here to have a conversation and learn. 2, treat folks with basic respect and decency. And 3, no spam, but posting relevant resources is welcome. And with that, I'll introduce our subject, what could go right and what could go wrong with the next version of the internet. We've assembled a group of panelists from a spectrum of viewpoints on Web3 technology. And to be clear, Web3 is a term we use broadly to refer to the next version of the internet. We aren't interested in letting crypto boosters claim a term with such history and narrow the possible futures of the internet to blockchain alone, however interesting decentralized ledger technology is. We are approaching this subject in a hopeful manner, given that we have such a solid foundation on the shortcomings of Web 2. Digital rights activists today know who has been failed and how. Many of us are also careful to differentiate between what is a technology issue and what is a human issue technology makes more visible. Technology is not a replacement for the hard organizing work necessary to address social issues and inequities, but technology may assist us in coordination, safety, and learning. It's important for Web3 developers and activists to work together toward the goal of a better and more equitable digital world. And in that spirit, I will hand this off to Michael Kleinman, Director of the Silicon Valley Initiative at Amnesty International.
Thank you all so much for joining. My name is Michael Kleinman, and as Leah said, I lead Amnesty's work here in Silicon Valley, focusing on the human rights implications of technology, for better and for worse. What fascinates me the most about Web3 are the related questions of autonomy and control. So much of our online experience today is shaped and controlled by a handful of large companies. To what extent do nascent Web3 structures like DAOs allow us to organize outside the existing corporate structures? This sounds potentially utopian, freeing us from the shackles of big tech. But that framing is, I think, an oversimplification. The question isn't when will Web3 replace the internet as we know it, but instead, how will these new technologies fit beside existing platforms? What needs do they meet and what niches do they fill? With that, I'm thrilled to introduce today's amazing panelists. Today, we will hear from 4 speakers. Jasmine Sun, co-founder and director of Reboot, who will speak on the topic of social media, social movements, and what Web3 can learn. Anil Dash, CEO of Glitch and member of the board at the Electronic Frontier Foundation, who will speak on the topic of the patterns of Web 2 that every Web3 advocate should know about. Nathan Schneider, professor of media studies at the University of Colorado, Boulder, who will speak on the relationship between crypto and the co-op tradition, points of overlap and points of divergence, and how we might use these tools to enable more economic democracy. And finally, author and activist Cory Doctorow, who will be speaking about Web3 and trust. Each panelist will speak for a few minutes, and then we'll have an extended Q&A. Please feel free to put any questions in the chat, and as Leah said, please always assume good intentions. And with that, Jasmine, please take us away.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, first of all, for inviting me. I feel really honored to be here alongside y'all's organizations, which have done great work, and alongside Cory, Anil, and Nathan, who are big personal inspirations of mine. My name is Jasmine. I use she, her pronouns, and I am the co-creator and director of Reboot at joinreboot.org. We're a publication and a community for young technologists reclaiming techno-optimism for a better collective future. What that really means is we are very interested in how technologies, new and old, might be used to enable social, political, and human progress, not merely technological. When I think about growing up as a kid, I'm fairly young. One of the most pivotal moments for really thinking about technology was watching the Arab Spring unfold. I think I was probably 11 or so. And it was probably the first time I was always much more interested in writing social justice. I wasn't like tinkering. I never considered myself like a tech person, but it was fascinating for me to see mainstream news outlets get that wrong. While a lot of young people, many of them not that much older than me, probably my age now, were using Twitter to coordinate a thousands wide mass movement and enact real political change. And then as I continued to get older and be on the internet and continue learning, I saw Black Lives Matter, I saw Me Too, I saw countless more movements, I participated in movements, created movements, all sort of enabled again by the internet and by many of these like Web2 platforms that we've heard about. And one thing that's always been super interesting to me is while tech giants like Twitter, Apple, Google, Facebook might not have designed their products for activist uses, their products have been appropriated to extend the capabilities of those who were. And so I've been very interested in the complicated relationship, I guess, between bottom-up social and political movements and the centralized profit-hungry platforms and the technical infrastructures that have become these movements' tools in their infrastructure. Now, Web3 could change this. It could change some of this. And I've been watching the space and learning about it for a lot of the past year. And I am quite optimistic in some ways that a lot of builders in Web3 are thinking just as much about technological change as they are about social political change. And that is really exciting to me. I'm excited by what censorship resistance can do for activists and journalists, especially in regions where repression is prominent. I've seen really interesting prototypes for things like using zero knowledge protocols to enable anonymous messaging, which could help, say, like whistleblowers. Even the ability, like, just to crowdfund across borders would be transformative. But I guess I wanted to use my few minutes to mention some of the things that a lot of folks have learned from Web2 social movements and Web2 organizing efforts, and in particular about the limitations of some of those social movements, which I think might inform similar efforts in Web3 and maybe get us faster to the place that we want to be. Because in the end, I think that most of activism and social change, like Leah said, is about the people, not about the technology. So I'll just list a few things. And most of these were just learned from observation, from reading, et cetera. Number one is that speed can come at the cost of trust, and that frictionlessness isn't always a good thing. In her book, Twitter and Tear Gas, I think of Zeynep Tufekci, engineer and sociologist, who talks about while digital frictionlessness helps assemble power and money really, really quickly, this can come at the cost of developing what she calls network internalities, of movements' ability to build trust, to coalesce among very different people around strategic decisions, to deliberate both internally and externally to present a unified front. A lot of these skills come from meetings, planning, these sorts of repeated interactions, doing logistics. And I think one thing that Web3 can be risky around is replacing codified trust and codified consensus in place of where the very hard human work of trust building and consensus used to be. Another thing I'll point out, number two, is that I think that low intention newcomers to a movement can sometimes distract from a committed core. And I think that sort of builds off number one. When it is too easy to join and exit a group, I know Web3 talks a lot about the value of exit, which in many cases is a good thing. Leaders and core contributors in a movement can be distracted by constant training and churn management and dealing with a lot of folks coming in and out who you haven't necessarily built context or trusted relationships with, and if you don't know, will stick around. In the book Working in Public, which is about open source, Nadia Ekbal emphasizes how most open source projects are led by a few maintainers, while a lot of new people to the project end up taking away more in attentional resources than they give, especially when they aren't willing to do maintenance work, which tends to fall on core contributors, and also in particular, oftentimes on women and on people who are usually unwittingly delegated a lot of care work. A third point is that viral dynamics on Web2 platforms benefit marketers more than activists. Every online movement comes with its share of grifters, from Sean King's sort of disappearing donations to the Red Cross's mismanagement of donation funds in Haiti. Web3 today is still dependent on a lot of the viral dynamics of Web2 platforms. And it's even more hype-driven with token-based financial incentives for every endorser, not simply just the attention economy, but actually real financial economies around the valuation of awareness. And I think that Ponzinomics and conflicts of interest become especially dangerous in activism. And Web3 will need to develop credibility and reputation structures beyond the Web2 platforms that distribute those attentional resources, beyond retweets, beyond token prices, some other form of way of establishing credibility. And then the final note, which I think most folks in Web3 are very aware of, is that accessibility comes first. In a mass movement, it doesn't matter how good your tools are if people can't use them. Things like Android compatibility or user-friendly interfaces or gas fees or the ability for web platforms to work on slower internet networks, to work on 3G. These are huge blockers to usefulness, and it just, until you get past those, you're not going to be able to build a mass movement on a Web3. So anyway, these are just a few propositions that I know a lot of folks have done a lot more research and thinking around. And I think that overall, I'm still quite optimistic. Web3 could be as much of a cultural or an organizational innovation as it is technological. And in particular, I think a lot of builders in Web3 are already trying to tackle these age-old problems and have a lot of emphasis and intention already placed on governance, or on contribution, on compensation, on decision-making. But I think it would be really valuable for folks who are in Web3 today to sort of go back to the case studies of a lot of early excitement around open source and around like commons-based peer production and around mass online movements that have occurred over the past few decades, and thinking about how do we tackle the very human problems that have sort of become the limitations of online organizing. So that's probably the few things that I'll introduce for today. And again, really excited to be here, excited to hear what other panelists have to say.
Jasmine, thank you. That was phenomenal. And passing it over to you, Anil.
Thanks. Yeah, and thanks. First of all, it is just exciting to be amongst this cohort of folks who have thought so deeply about these things. And, you know, I had originally started with, let me give an overview, a sort of survey, I think maybe in a parallel vein to what Jasmine had done. And I sort of pulled away from that because I wanted to tell a story, because I realized a lot of my perspective on thinking about Web3 is informed by what came to later be called Web2. And for example, in Jasmine's case, where I think she's one of the great thinkers and leaders on this work, she could be forgiven for not being familiar with obscure technical decisions we made when she was 2 years old. And so I think there's something that I feel I want to share, which is there's a history here. When we talk about decentralization, when we talk about the idealism of technology in general, the internet broadly, the web in particular, enabling movements, enabling people to express themselves and connect. We have had that animating force and that aspiration, you know, for decades now, and we have not achieved what we thought we might, what we hoped we might. And so I think there's something that I wanted to call out, which is a story that might be illustrative about how I've started to form a point of view. And Cory, your point is well taken. It was uphill both ways all the time. You know, I am that. I have earned the gray hairs in my beard, and I think about how can that be useful to somebody else. And so I start with in the communities, like I've jumped into Discords with folks who are forming DAOs and are advocating for the NFTs that they want people to collect or whatever it is. And a lot of their enthusiasm comes from that idealism. We're going to make something new and it's not going to have all these problems. I say, well, what are you responding to? And they tell me they're reacting to Web 2. And I say, okay, well, tell me about Web 2, right? Because I know when that term was applied to the cohort of people that I was part of that were creating something, we felt like outsiders had applied it to us. We had terms like there was the .com people that had been the opportunists in the late 90s, and we were the web people. And we didn't want all those suits and those people with their spreadsheets and their MBAs to come in and ruin it all. And so we had built a rhetoric too of what we were in opposition to. And, you know, as is the nature of such things, now we are the suits, right? And I think one of the most important parts was we cared deeply about decentralization, about distributed infrastructures, about empowering people to control and own their data and their presence online, about enabling people to have their own infrastructure, about making sure creators were fairly compensated. Many other principles too, but we really thought this is going to be the set of technologies and tools that enable people to do this. And I think it's important to frame that up because those of us who, again, later were called Web 2.0 curators or people who created technologies there, we're not uniformly stupid. Certainly some of us were, but not everybody was. And so the fact that what actually came of Web 2 to an approximation was Facebook broadly enabling fascism is a pretty abject failure compared to starting from those ideals. And so it makes me wonder, how does that happen? How did we get that far? Like, I think there were many other brilliant things that were created, but it's hard for me to point to, well, there once was a company that made a product that has stopped existing 15 years ago and it did some things right, as a way of saying it wasn't all bad, when the things that persisted were in many cases the most opportunistic and destructive. And so I think the illustrative example I want to drive towards is towards the late MySpace era. It was evident that Facebook was rising and that the prior networks were fading, those being things like Friendster and MySpace and LiveJournal, which was the team that I got to work with, all of which had tens of millions of users. It's important to understand these were not small, these were not rounding errors. Each of them in turn had been the thing we thought would be dominant. And importantly, in the moment that I'm going to talk about, the thing that had the attention of all the developers in Silicon Valley was Facebook's application platform. People have somewhat forgotten that this existed, but they had a big conference they called F8. Fate as a name for your event is a hell of a choice. And it was around the same period as Apple had launched their App Store. And so for scale, far more developers were interested in developing and creating for Facebook's platform than for Apple's App Store. It's hard to imagine, but it was true, and it was true by a lot. And so because of the amount of attention and hype and just basically investment that had gotten, the sort of gang of everybody else got together and said, we are going to counter Facebook's closed proprietary platform with an open effort. The signature app of that era was Farmville. So everybody was getting spammed with lots and lots of invitations to Farmville on their Facebook wall, and people sort of said, this is going to be the thing that's the death of the rest of us. So this unlikely band of allies got together here, MySpace and Friendster and Google, which then had, I'm going to forget, it was Buzz or Plus, one of those was coming up, but just some failed Google social network, as tended to happen every couple of months back then. And Google hosted an event for it. They put some money in, they had a bonfire for some reason, they invited the media, and everybody came and they learned about a new open standard called Open Social. ORCID, that's right. Thank you, Cory. That was it. It was ORCID at that era. And Open Social was going to be the counter to all the closed, proprietary, terrible things that Facebook was doing. And there was a big launch event, and they sort of said, here's the technology. We're going to be able to build our own Farmville, but on the open internet, and it'll work across all of these things. And it will be decentralized, and users will control their data, and it'll be more privacy respecting, and all the other things that we aspired to. I'll skip a lot of the story, but being part of the consortium that had created this thing, I did what was the done thing then and has sort of returned now in Substack form. I wrote a blog post celebrating this great announcement, right? Here's this thing, open's going to win, open always wins. This was a lot of the belief of the time too, right? Android was going to win because it was open. And so I was very excited, and I really believed because I was a true believer. It wasn't just my job to advocate. I advocated and made it my job because I believed, which is, I think, true for a lot of Web3 folks who are in that sort of sentiment right now. And I got what I saw as true validation. The guy who I saw as one of the pioneers of having invented the web browser in the first place, on his personal blog, linked to mine and said, the smartest take on open social today was by Anil. And I was like, this is very flattering because no less a figure than Mark Andreessen has co-signed my idea. And I really thought that meant I was right. I think it was a year later that Mark was on the board of Facebook, and they perfectly executed to destroy that entire ecosystem. And in fact, they even destroyed their own F8 Facebook app platform as they moved to mobile. They sort of obviated most of those things. Farmville made the cut, but almost nothing else did. So they were willing to sacrifice their own developer platform and that own thing just to make sure that that entire ecosystem would go away. And it was very, very successful. And all of those other networks faded, and all the effort, millions of dollars, and lots of human hours of work put into all those other platforms essentially came to nothing. There are no apps that really live on our social networking platforms today. And I came to understand, and I have I don't know Mark Andreessen well enough to have an animosity towards him, but I I definitely learned a lesson about what the actual goal was of sitting in those seats, whether it was as a venture capitalist or on the board of Facebook or the other roles that he had. I do not think his goals and the goals of his peers in his own firm and the other firms that he worked with have changed since then. I don't. And I see that some of the biggest investments they've made in the history of their firm now are in platforms that they assert will do this thing again, this time for real. They're going to give you control of your data. They're going to decentralize who has the ability to share and distribute their work. They're going to empower developers to create new experiences they couldn't create. And, I got fooled once, and it really suited my ego to feel like I was on the right side. I really thought, this time we've got it. And it could be that the enormous wealth they've made off of the other companies they bet on, and certainly on the crypto space and in Web3 in general, has made them reflect and say, we would like to change, and we're going to do it differently this time. But I don't think so. I don't actually think so. I think, this is definitely a fool me once kind of situation for me. And I don't like to be cynical. I am an optimist. I am somebody that believes things can change. But ultimately, if this new infrastructure were about devolving power to people and were about enabling, for example, economic opportunity for more people, then it would structurally be a very stupid bet for venture capitalists to put a ton of money into. The math doesn't work. You don't bet on something where the return is going to go to other people. And so that's sort of my fundament, which is they could be wrong. They could be incredibly generous, but I sure don't think they're bad with money. So that's sort of my underpinning about a higher foreign point of view about these things. None of that is to impugn, I think, the very positive motivations of people. It does my heart good to see lots and lots of people who love technology talking about there being decentralized and distributed infrastructures, and to care about who owns their data, and to care about who profits from the things we create. I think those are great conversations to have. I think they're insufficiently skeptical about who's funding and enabling the platforms that it's built on. And I think that is a vital, essential conversation to have as we know and see from history our optimism is not enough.
Anil, thank you so much. That was fascinating. And it's an interesting segue to Nathan with, perhaps a slightly different economic view of what Web3 could bring. So over to you, Herr Professor.
Okay, thank you so much. It's a great discussion so far. I come out of this really, as Michael said, from an economic perspective. During the last decade, I've been kind of tracking two things: first as a reporter, and then as a researcher. On the one hand, the development of blockchain and related technologies, which first grabbed me, as soon as the Ethereum white paper came out, and I was, as Jasmine suggested, I'd been covering social movements and was looking for the technology, the kind of missing technologies that could fill some of the gaps that Zeynep Tufekci identified so powerfully. But at the same time, I was following a lot of those activists into the cooperative movement. And I ended up writing a book about this new generation of people coming into the cooperative business tradition, a way of doing business in which stakeholders co-own and co-govern the businesses they serve. And so for the last decade, I've worked with a whole bunch of startups trying to do shared ownership, shared governance, and accountability in tech, building kind of alternative to that venture capital model to serve community needs more than growth at all costs. And I've been, along with those founders, beating my head up against the wall, watching brilliant people with incredible ideas utterly unable to compete in the system that is so designed for investor ownership and investor control. There are so many ways that we don't recognize, created by law and norm and culture, that that privilege investor ownership far above community ownership and community accountability. And so I kind of came back into the crypto world, focusing on co-ops as long as I could, and trying to enable those kinds of models, as I still do. But increasingly, some of the kinds of things that crypto is now enabling are opening doors and at least create some possibilities that we're not seeing elsewhere. Now, I don't think you need technology to do economic democracy. I think you could do it with better policies, with a different kind of economic system, but we're not getting that right now. And at this point, I'm very interested in whatever we can do to open doors to shared ownership, shared governance, and a different view into how we experience our everyday politics and online lives. And so much about Web 2 has ended up creating norms of relying on benevolent dictators and moderators and admins. Part of it goes down to the structure of the server-client relationship. And there are some ways in which, among all of the, I have seen more dystopias, for more years than a lot of people in this space, and yet the possibilities that start to show up here as well are ones that I think could open doors to things we need. An example of this: a few years ago, after working for years to build competitors to platforms like Uber and Airbnb on a cooperative basis, both of those companies in 2018 asked the SEC to let them share ownership with their kind of core user base ahead of their IPO, and the SEC essentially said no, and that is striking. Some of the most powerful companies in the world that are able to get, it seems, whatever they want, can't do this ownership sharing thing under current law. That was pretty striking. At the same time, in the last year and a half or so, a company in my backyard, a Ethereum-based platform for kind of gig work and donations called Gitcoin, did an exit from its incubator Consensus with venture involved, investors involved, but in the process distributed governance tokens to its users. Now, the legal labels are ambiguous around what exactly it is they did, but those governance tokens are also reflective of the value that those contributors were part of creating. So there's a lot of gray area here, and I think we want some clarity. But at the same time, these tools are opening at least imaginative doors to some of the very things that are not possible under current regimes and should be. It's a pliable space, a space that is changing all the time, that I think is, where a lot of those norms, those expectations are in flux. Venture capitalists are doing weird things like delegating their votes to university clubs, and a lot of the questions about how this is going to shake out are unanswered. And I find myself, even among these kind of dystopian realities of kind of libertarian DeFi and all kinds of scams and ransomware, wishing that more of my friends who are, rightly criticizing a lot of this stuff, rightly criticizing the kind of deepening of planet burning kind of hyper capitalism, to be involved in helping to reprogram these tools, because ultimately they are programmable tools, and what they do, how they work, depends on how they're programmed, and that includes how they do ownership and governance. So that, to me, is really the opportunity, the possibility, a kind of once in a few generations opportunity to rewrite some of the rules of ownership and governance. Technology always comes with politics, and the politics of the origin of Bitcoin, honestly, to me, are quite repulsive and unattractive. Nevertheless, the technology's politics kind of underdetermine its outcomes and its possibilities. And already we're seeing emergent political strains happening here in this space that demonstrate that it's not limited to the particular things that Satoshi Nakamoto, whoever they were, wanted to see happen. One thing that I'm increasingly interested in is the question of human rights in these contexts. These are potentially kind of new layers of global governance for economics and other things. Right now, as nations are wielding sanctions against Russia around the invasion of Ukraine, it makes one wonder, how might this kind of action look different if we were instead talking about freezing contracts on blockchains, if we were talking about bottom-up enforcement of human rights abuses. How could we design some of these systems to build in rights and values from the beginning, and ensure that as these things, if they do become important layers of global governance, that they actually advance on some of the partial successes in achieving a global human rights regime of the past, rather than rolling back. And I really recommend that anybody interested in that question look at the DWeb principles that the Internet Archive architected. I was lightly involved in developing them as well. But to me, these are really, I prefer DWeb as a frame to Web3, because Web3 is about what technology is sitting on the back end. I'm interested as well in what goals do we expect of ourselves and of our work with this technology. And I think we need to hold those, principles like that about what we are actually doing with it higher than what technology we happen to use to get there. So to me, the technology is interesting. It's fun to learn about. It's fun to play with. But ultimately, the goal in my mind is an opportunity to rewrite economic rules, to create a new framework of enforcement and global governance to address some of the profound problems we're facing. These tools do open some doors in that way. We could open those doors in other ways. But right now, I'm interested in taking any opportunity we can get. Thanks.
Nathan, thank you. That was just incredibly interesting. Still processing what new rules could look like. And with that, Cory, bring us home.
Thank you very much. So I, like Anil, as I mentioned in the chat, but only to panelists because Zoom chat is cursed. I also walked uphill in both directions just to validate my RSS feeds in the snow barefoot. So I remember a lot of this stuff too. And in particular, I remember the cypherpunks and the belief among advocates for cryptography, at least some of them, that you could build a stable demimonde that was separate from the corruption of states and their lack of respect for human rights, that with keys of sufficient length, it wouldn't matter whether governments passed bad laws. And even in those days, there was a pretty well understood rejoinder to this, which is a term called rubber hose cryptanalysis, which is to say that sometimes if you want to break a cipher, or if you want to decrypt a message rather, the easiest way to get the unlocking keys is not to brute force them, but to kidnap the person who knows the passphrase and hit them with a rubber hose until they tell you what it is. And there is no key length long enough to defend against rubber hose cryptanalysis. There's really only one thing that defends against rubber hose cryptanalysis, and that's the rule of law built around a framework of human rights. And the internal contradiction of the cypherpunks was that within them, there was a political strain that wanted to dismantle states as illegitimate rather than reform them as maintainers of this rule of law. And the problem is that in the Mad Max future, the Ayn Rand future, there is no reason for someone not to kidnap you and hit you with a rubber hose until you reveal your key. And yet although I reject that future and I don't advocate for it, I do advocate for cryptography and have now for 20 years with EFF. And the reason for that is that I see that cryptography is both a temporary shelter in which we can build, foment institutions that are better than the ones that we have. We can hide from the people who would harm us or neutralize us for a time.
And also because I believe that the existence of private spaces, in addition to being a good thing for the human mind and human discourse, are also a hedge against the worst forms of human rights abuse, because the people who have power always have to contend with the possibility that the people they have power over might do things where they can't overhear them. And so that together, these combine to make a better equilibrium than trying to secede from civil society with extremely well-formed and peer-reviewed ciphers, or rejecting technology as having any role in social change, which was the other current that has gone through our discourse over the last 2 decades since the era of the cypherpunks, 3 decades since the era of the cypherpunks. And so I want to relate that now to DAOs, Web3, blockchain, and what I call blockchainism, although I know some people hate that. So the promise of blockchain and blockchainism is, I think, that it facilitates trust by turning what would otherwise be social agreements into computational ones. So you can create a smart contract, and that smart contract can say, if A does X, then B gets Y. And you don't have to worry that there's an umpire or a referee or a escrow agent, or what Alan Turing called the oracle, the person who tells the computer what's right and what's wrong. You don't have to worry that that person might cheat, because the computer can't cheat. The computer is just looking at the facts, and the facts are public, they're in the ledger, and everyone can see them. And I think that this promise is overstated. I think, in fact, that this promise is a distraction, because the reality is that there will always have to be oracles. So I before the lockdown, was in Brussels for a meeting, and I met someone who worked with an EU-funded Blockchain for Good NGO, and they told me about this thing that they were very proud of, where they were putting food commodities on the blockchain. So they would record, the varietal of seeds. They would record the pesticide use, the labor conditions, and all of the other parts of the production and transport of that food, how it got from the person who grew it to the person who ate it. And you could validate that on the way, and you wouldn't have to worry about greenwashing. You wouldn't have to worry about labor washing, or you could just check it because the facts were there. So after hearing this pitch, I said, how do I know that the person who keyed in the labor conditions wasn't lying when they entered it irrevocably into the blockchain? And they said, well, you just sort of have to trust it. And I said, well, how do I know that the banana I bought is the banana that the blockchain describes as having been produced under these fair conditions? They said, we just have to trust that too. And I said, well, if we found someone we can trust to record the conditions under which the banana was grown, and someone we can trust to positively identify this banana as being the banana described in the recording, why do we need the blockchain? And in the article that I pasted into the chat accidentally several times, I propose an equation, which is that if problem plus blockchain equals problem minus blockchain, then blockchain equals 0. Right? In other words, if adding blockchain to the problem leaves you with exactly the same problem, which is you don't know who to trust when they tell you how your banana was grown, then blockchain is not solving the problem. And the thing is that every significant kind of decision that you can make with a blockchain, agreement that you can make with a blockchain, involves quantizing some qualitative element in the world, turning something that happened in the physical world into something recorded on the blockchain, where a human has to do it, and where a human who does it unfaithfully or carelessly or maliciously can mess up the whole system, can blow up the trust. And even the things that seem very, very, very well defined, like did you pay your mortgage this month, are in fact squishier than you think, because I didn't pay my mortgage this month because my bank got indicted for stealing mortgage payments, and I decided that I wasn't going to give my money to the bank this month. That seems like a pretty good reason not to pay your mortgage. And if someone had a collateralized debt obligation that was riding on that mortgage payment, I think there's a good case for not paying it out. But a human has to make that determination, not a blockchain. And as soon as you're trusting a human to make that determination, it raises this question, why is the blockchain there at all? And I'll give you the example that I think is clearest about how hard it is to make crisp determinations about things that happen in the real world. And more importantly, how power relationships affect what we determine to be the factual basis for understanding what happened in the world. So I helped a friend of mine, Ben Laurie, with a project called Certificate Transparency. It's not a blockchain project, but it is a public ledger. And you use it every day because every time your browser gets a certificate from a server that says you are talking to your bank or your employer or your e-commerce giant or your favorite social network, your browser makes a hash of that signed certificate and fires it off to one or more certificate transparency servers. You can operate one of those. It's like a single unit rack mount machine, pretty commodity to run one of those. And because it's a very efficient system, it can monitor the entire web. It's web scale observation of every certificate being issued and used on the web. And anyone can monitor those servers. And Google, who were the people who proposed this, do monitor those servers, because one of the things that we're really worried about is that your browser has thousands of certificate authorities in its roots of trust, right? It's thousands of people who can issue a certificate that says you are talking to Google. And if one of those people is faithless and issues a bad certificate, then that person can spy on Google traffic, on traffic between Google and its users. So Google builds this web scale, anyone can use it, anyone can participate in it, observatory for SSL traffic, and pretty much immediately discovers that Symantec is issuing bad Google certificates. Now, they have irrefutable proof that Symantec is issuing bad certificates because Symantec's signing key signed it. And so here they are holding the proof that Symantec shouldn't be in any browser's root of trust. Symantec are still in your root of trust. And the reason for that is that power matters. Symantec made the completely unreasonable explanation that for idiotic reasons that will never be fully explained, their production server process, the last step in it when they set up a new server, was to issue a fake Google certificate to make sure it was working, right? This is just like, this permanently disqualifies them from having anything to do with security or, running a lemonade stand. But they are systemically important. They're too big to fail. And so if your analysis sits only at the layer of did it happen or didn't it happen, did we program it to happen or didn't we program it to happen, then you're going to be disappointed. And I'll close by saying that I think that is intrinsic to blockchainism. I'm not saying that it's immutable. Maybe we can change it or redeem it. But intrinsic to blockchainism is this idea of system design based on a balance of incentives grounded in personal interest. That the reason that a system works, the reason, Bitcoin works, is because it is presumed to be economically irrational to spend $1 billion to steal $500 million. That no one would ever do it for spite, or no one would ever do it for some other cause. And that belief, which infects every part of distributed governance, including the issue of governance tokens that are maybe fungible or non-fungible, but they are surely alienable, which is to say tradable, which is to say you can speculate on them, which is to say some fraction of the people who are involved in your governance structure are involved not because they care about providing a public good, but because they want their tokens to appreciate, which they hope to flog off. That to the extent that you do that, you expose yourself to that risk. That ultimately, if the incentive you appeal to is not solidarity, but self-interest, you cannot be surprised when people act in their self-interest instead of in solidarity. Before Thatcher in the UK, if you were below a certain income threshold, you were entitled to live in a flat, a public housing flat, a council flat. And when you were done with it, you gave it back. You couldn't speculate on it. Margaret Thatcher argued through Right to Buy that she could airdrop these flats into the wallets of the people who lived in them. She gave them their flats basically for free. And that this would align everyone's incentives by creating an ownership society. 40 years later, all of those tokens, all of those flats are owned by offshore billionaires who've created safe deposit boxes in the sky. London has the worst housing crisis in England, which has the worst housing crisis in the United Kingdom, which has the worst housing crisis in Europe. Well, Europe-ish. And we have signally failed to provide the public good because we replace solidarity with self-interest. So that's where I'll end.
Thank you so much, everyone. This has been awesome, and also has run quite a bit longer than we hoped, to reserve more time for the Q&A period. But I also feel like a lot of the questions or thoughts that we've been seeing have been answered throughout this discussion. So I think I'll kick this off, just coming out of Cory's talk with a little bit of a question with a specific example. So when I think about a blockchain powered project like Northwest Rural Broadband Alliance, which enables people to own and profit from infrastructure and then sell high-speed internet access to their neighbors, and that's happening right now in states like Montana, I see this as like a great use case for an Oracle, like what Cory's talking about. The service provided and the cost due are all quantifiable in code that eliminates much, not all, but much of the overhead and upfront costs that would be necessary for a traditional ISP to serve these communities of 200, 500, 1,000 people, where that investment just isn't happening and that access didn't exist until this project. And so I wonder if like the promise around oracles is just that's being made is the wrong promise. Not that they enable perfect human trust, but that they remove layers of overhead for more complex and reoccurring agreements that happen between people wholly online. And these are, agreements that have only traditionally been accessible to those with the financial resources to invest in their often quite expensive enforcement. So yeah, I'm very curious if the wrong promise is being made here, but if there is still a promise, and what folks think about that. Anybody's welcome to answer.
I mean, I think that, that kind of infrastructure project, points to the kind of thing that we need to be able to do one way or another, right? I mean, I think of a kind of gold standard as the 1936 Rural Electrification Act, which enabled financing for people like, farmers like my grandfather who didn't have electricity. He didn't grow up with any electricity growing up because investors didn't want to come there, and enable them to self-finance building electric cooperatives that, electrified rural America within a few years. I think, these tools can enable some of those mechanisms to happen, but I think you also see a lot of counter patterns happening, right? Where there is the tooling for a kind of community ownership and distributed ownership, and a change in even what we mean by ownership through these programmable contracts. But at the same time, you see the need for ensuring that it's not just what crypto people call the whales, the very wealthy people. Sorry, my daughter is pulling on my cord. The whales.
Distribute the power, Nathan. You got to
share to control who gets to build these projects. And I think that's a insistence that one way or another we need to design for enabling access to ownership and control by the people who need it most, who are underserved in the current system. There's some context in which perhaps these kinds of tools might enable capital flows to move in important directions. But for instance, when we had conversations last week about the future of policy around crypto here in Colorado, I was pointing back to the way in which Colorado is starting to support and aid employees in buying their own businesses. Maybe if we're serious about using these tools, we need to also ensure that there is public financing to ensure that people have real access to the means of ownership. Again, whether you need blockchains to do that or not, I'm kind of indifferent to ultimately. But again, the fact that you are seeing these experiments happening with blockchains is really important. It was small experiments that in New York, upstate New York, that inspired FDR to move forward with a national policy along those lines.
I think that's really well said. I think that it is true that the ultimate answer to electrification and rural telephone co-ops was a public finance facility and legislation, and not incidentally holding AT&T at bay, which is a project that went on for 68 years before they were broken up and then was immediately abandoned, allowing them to reform. But you're right that it started with co-ops in upstate New York. It started with small groups of people doing it for themselves. And I don't know that you need a ledger to do it, right? I'm like, one of the things that I find fascinating and weird is that the best deliberation tool I know, which is the Pirate Party's Liquid Democracy, which lets people delegate their votes to each other. So I can say, well, in all environmental issues, I let Naomi Klein have my vote. And then Naomi can say, well, I know this one hydrologist who gets all of the votes that I have when it comes to water and so on, and we can revoke those votes and so on. Someone has re-implemented this on the blockchain for DAOs. And I'm like, oh, so you made it slower and less secure. And you still need a formal legal structure that is not a DAO to make sure that when the DAO votes to do something, that whoever actually is the person who has the power to do the thing does the thing. And if they choose not to, the DAO gives you no legally enforceable right to make them do it. And so, I am all in favor of rural broadband co-ops. And, everyone who's watching, the US has just made another $45 billion available federally for broadband. It is in the form of block grants to states. If you live in a state that decided not to take the ACA expansion money, they probably won't take the broadband expansion money either. You need to work on your state house in your town. If you live in California, there's $8 billion in play statewide, and it goes to local governments. So get your local government involved. And it does exactly this. We deserve better broadband for sure.
Yeah, I would sort of second that. I think, yes, first of all, the block grant funding on the order of, the better part of $50 billion is unprecedented in our lifetimes and has gone woefully underreported. And there's no reason we couldn't turn it into a modern rural electrification project. It is only narrative that keeps us from being able to do so. I think that's a pretty extraordinarily low barrier. Like, the money is there, we just got to tell people we want it, is a very different position than we've been in. But it gets to this broader idea, whether we are talking about electrification or internet access, the sort of co-op ISPs and these other sort of approaches, all of them are predicated on universality, right? There is a breadth, and then we talked a lot about solidarity in this sort of text chat around this. And necessarily, those are infrastructures that don't optimize for efficiency. And I think one of the things we see in tension with this, that a lot of the conversation happens around how is crypto going to help us? How's web3 going to help us? How is moving things to a blockchain going to help us? Is it'll be so efficient, right? And that is not the primary goal of good governance infrastructures, right? If your concern is to serve all, and especially the vulnerable, you will not build the most efficient system. You will build a complete system and a comprehensive system. And I think this is one of those misapprehensions that people who come in tech first on these often get wrong, right? And again, in the 90s, there was a brief moment where tech execs, or even non-tech execs, but just business execs, would go fly first class on a plane, read the magazine in the seat back pocket, and learn about a new programming language, Java. And then they would come back to their companies that they worked at and tell everybody, we got to get some Java. And they'd be like, well, what is that? And they're like, I don't know, but I know we need it, right? And to the great chagrin of the technologists, people sort of say, but I don't know what I'm going to use that for. And that might not be the right language. And it has a lot of that energy right now around, well, blockchain's going to help. And it's like, well, okay, maybe what you need is a ledger. Maybe it needs to be distributed. Maybe it needs to be trustless, although very rarely. Maybe it needs to be slower, although very rarely. What are we shooting for here, right? And so when you presuppose the technical solution to a problem, you probably aren't thinking about the problem. And I think that Cory's formulation of the problem plus or minus blockchain still equals problem is a pretty strong indication of it not being appropriate. And so I think that thing here is that, the irony is, as much as blockchains are woefully inefficient around their consumption of energy and resources, they are trying to be overly efficient in optimizing. We took the humans out of the mix. And it's like the humans are what you need in the mix on all these human problems. And so I think there's this pattern that I really worry about, and particularly in the context we're talking here about activism, movements, and especially community-led movements, are about getting people together and making sure they're all coming along, right? Like, this is the whole point of it. This is not about the sort of lone, brilliant creator. This is about a movement. Any of these movements are people sort of pulled together, and so necessarily these technologies tend to be poor at that because they're optimizing for, well, you can take the humans out of the mix, and so I think there's a cultural tension that is one of the reasons that this gets so polarized. That being said, I do love the idealism of what I see in so many Web3 advocates. I love that they're talking about these concepts that we've cared about, and it's a little bit of the monkey's paw curling its fingers, where we sort of say, what if millions of people would get reinterested in decentralizing the web and controlling their data and having some agency over what their experience is online? I'd be like, great, that's what we've been hoping for all these years. And like, but guess what? One little catch, and then you're like, man, they're going to financialize everything? Like, really? That's the trade-off. I think that's the thing that I really, really struggle with.
Terrific. And guys, we're going to try and get one last question in. Totally understand if people need to jump off. And we're going to try and wrap some questions together. So I apologize if this is a little woolly, but a number of people have spoken about how the internet became different than what its pioneers wanted. What are ways that we can avoid this for Web3, especially given some of the issues around VC funding that were discussed earlier, which presupposes that it's worthwhile to try and avoid this, that there's some there with Web3. And I'd love to start with Jasmine, and then everyone sort of a final word.
Could you repeat the very last part of your question? I was typing a response to the chat. I'm so sorry.
You know what? I'm not even sure I remember the last part of my question. I'll do my best. What are ways that we can help ensure that Web3 does not repeat the problems of Web2, especially given some of the issues around the role of VCs and sort of the economic logic that dictates?
Yeah, I think I want to echo a lot of the things that folks have said. I think I agree a lot with, for example, Anil's skepticism of A16Z. They're investing a lot in media and policy. And I think there's a huge risk that folks sort of begin to conflate blockchain with decentralization, with democracy, which are all like very different things. And certainly they overlap in some ways, but certainly they also often don't. And I think it really benefits a lot of VCs and a lot of sort of traditional capitalist actors and large tech platforms when people think those things are all the same, right? Like in the early days of Web2, people also thought that Facebook and Twitter were very much democratizing forces, and just the notion of everything is democratized. I guess one of the things that I would be really encouraged by is more opportunities to educate and to involve folks with the design of things like DAOs and governance who are not even really in the technology space, is one big thing that I think about. Like, I think that a lot of Nathan's work is probably really relevant here, but like traditions like co-ops have existed for a long time. And while things like the blockchain can certainly be useful for elements of that, I often feel like many Web3 builders will allude to those traditions or to various histories, like this would be great for activists, this would be great for co-ops, this would be great for so-and-so, without ever really talking to folks who have experience in those areas. And maybe this is a good idea for a future panel. And like here, I also think about the high barrier to entry just for even understanding or knowing what all of the different like crypto related words mean. It took me forever. And so I'd be pretty optimistic as well about efforts by folks who are in Web3 to run programs like compensated programs where they get folks who might be very critical but have relevant expertises in governance and in organizing to come into the discussion and learn together.
Jasmine, that's great. And I realized there we're at time, but
Oh, I'm so sorry.
no. That was your response was perfect. I just, if anyone has to jump off, totally understand, but I also just want to say to Nathan, Anil, and Cory, if you want to have answer this question, then we can end, or it's up to you guys.
Yeah, I think there's an opportunity to really call some of the rhetoric of this space on its bluff. For instance, one small example is when the Securities and Exchange Commission started using this language of sufficiently decentralized, saying that we're not going to treat you like a security if you are actually doing the thing you're saying you're doing. I think that could go a lot further by, for instance, building in rules and protocols that, for instance, redistribute wealth when there is concentration, redistribute power when there are concentrations, that for instance, privilege labor above investment capital. We're already seeing DAOs and other projects doing that sort of thing. Make a separation. It again, kind of echoing the cooperative movement in certain respects. But in a lot of ways, like there's a lot of utopian language out there, and a lot of it is nonsense, honestly, in terms of what's actually in the technology and what's actually being done. And if this stuff is going to be taken seriously as something we're going to accept into our world, I think a really important step is to just hold people to that rhetoric and deepen the demands that we place on it. Ensure that we are not blindsided by the fact that it's a new technology, and continue to stress the need, whatever the technology is, for kind of basic values of equity, justice, and rights.
Perfect. And Nathan, thank you. And Anil and Cory, any last thoughts?
I have something to say, but I will yield to Anil if he wants to go first.
I was just briefly going to say, I think Jasmine and Nathan summed it up really, really well. So I don't have anything to add.
So I will brief finally then for muscular antitrust law and remind everyone that the way that Facebook managed to capture everyone who hated Facebook and quit and went to Instagram was by telling absolutely risible lies to competition regulators about why they were buying Instagram and what they would do afterwards, which to their everlasting shame, competition regulators credulously believed and then failed to follow up on. And that, the transformation of the web from five giant websites, from like the wild and woolly web to five giant websites filled with screenshots of text from the other four, was not because of network effects and first mover advantage. It was because some companies that had a lot of access to the capital markets bought all of their rivals or crushed the ones they couldn't, or if they couldn't do either of those things, they just colluded with them and rigged markets and structured markets, like who gets to advertise and who sees the advertisement and how much are the advertisements worth and so on. All of those things are not technological outcomes, they're policy choices. And I will tell you that I think that we are better situated to have enforcement in that realm than most of us understand, because it is not just tech that is super concentrated. Pretty much every industry you've ever heard of is super concentrated, like one cheerleading league and one professional wrestling league and one company that owns every eyeglass company you've ever heard of and all the retailers and the largest lab and the largest insurer and makes more than half the lenses in the world. There's 4 giant shipping consortia and no one is in charge and saying you should stop building ships bigger and bigger and bigger because eventually they're going to get caught in the Suez Canal. 3 giant meat packing companies whose profits shot up even as they paid less and less to the meat packers. And the point of all of this, as James Boyle has pointed out, is that what looks like 1,000 issues is actually one issue with 1,000 ways to get involved. And Boyle, he says that, before the term ecology came along, it wasn't clear if I cared about owls and you cared about the ozone layer, what my charismatic nocturnal avians had to do with the gaseous composition of your upper atmosphere. But the term ecology turned that into one movement. And we have allies in this fight, allies that will not only help us in this corner of the world that we're fighting over, but also make our lives better in every way. Because the reality is that we have new kings, people who get to structure the daily rhythm of our lives in lots of ways. They're unaccountable, and the damage that they do to us as workers and as users of this technology, and just as bystanders who absorb the pollution and other externalities of their work. That is something that we all suffer under and that we all have common cause for. And so that's what I'll end with, is that antitrust matters and we can do something about it.
A huge thank you to not only our panelists, but also our participants. We will send out a recording of this and a link to all the publications and articles that appeared in the chat to everyone who registered. And stay tuned. We'll have more information about the next one in March shortly. And again, a huge thank you to Jasmine, Nathan, Anil, and Cory. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you all.